McDermott, and in this video we're going to look at two of the campaigns that were fought very early on in the Revolutionary War. First Boston, and then Long Island, New York. In the case of Boston, of course, with the arrival of the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, General Washington was able to fortify the heights looking down into Boston and in effect forcing the British to evacuate the town. In the second case, Long Island, New York, the British landed with reinforcements, and the first major battle between the British Army and George Washington's Continental Forces took place. The outcome was a near disaster for the Americans, and we'll look at that more closely in a minute. But first, to Boston. Those rebellious Americans who chased the British into Boston on 19 April 1775 took up positions in a rough crescent from the Mystic River in the north to Cambridge in the south, bottling up General Thomas Gage and his troops in the town of Boston. Although disorganized and without central direction, the Minutemen seemed intent on keeping the British cooped up until some kind of a conclusion could be arrived at. An uneasy tension marked the situation until the morning of 17 June, when the British discovered rebel fortifications had appeared overnight on the Charlestown Peninsula. British assaults conducted later in the day succeeded in dislodging the American defenders, but at a terrible cost to the British. While 411 Americans were either wounded or killed during the day, the British force, which numbered 2,250 soldiers, suffered 1,054 casualties, almost half their total force, before they were able to overrun those positions and dislodge the Americans. This very painful victory convinced British commanders to withdraw from the Charlestown Peninsula after burning the town and reinforcing their defenses in Boston. Content to sit tight and fortify the town, the British Army waited for reinforcements while the Americans prepared to continue the fight after participating in what proved to be the bloodiest battle of the complete Revolutionary War. Robert Steele was a local drummer boy in a regiment that joined the Breed's Hill Defenders early on the 17th of June. He later recalled, "The British marched with rather a slow step nearly up to our entrenchment, and the battle began. The conflict was sharp, but the British soon retreated with a quicker step than they had come up with, leaving some of their killed and wounded directly in front of us." A British officer wrote about his experience that hot afternoon. "Our troops advanced with great confidence, expecting an easy victory. As we approached, an incessant stream of fire poured from the rebel line. It seemed a continuous sheet of fire for nearly 30 minutes. Most of our grenadiers and light infantry, the moment they presented themselves, lost 3/4 and in some cases 9/10 of their men. Some companies had only 8 or 9 men left. Despite appalling losses, the British returned and assaulted twice more before overrunning the second defensive position on Bunker Hill." Delegates to the Second Continental Congress had previously gathered in Philadelphia on the 10th of May. One of their most pressing issues was to unite the colonies in a course of military action now that New England militias were fighting the British. John Adams argued the importance of demonstrating how the war was being waged for more than just New England purposes. He wanted to appoint a commander from one of the southern colonies that would also bring additional support from that region. After much debate, the Congress achieved unanimity and on 15 June 1775 authorized a Continental Army while also appointing George Washington commander-in-chief to command all the Continental forces raised or to be raised for the defense of American liberty. Members of the Congress had taken the measure of the man and described him as, quote, discreet and virtuous, no harum-scarum, ranting, swearing fellow, but sober, steady, and calm, no pretensions of elegance, a man of solid judgment and information, end quote. George Washington also gave the Revolution the respectability it needed to balance the Boston radicals who were best known to the British. George Washington thus became the first symbol of national unity before independence was actually declared, or a national flag, or a national seal had been created. General Washington's task was Herculean and included creating a Continental Army from a collection of militias in the immediate presence of a professional enemy. He immediately set to work, familiarizing himself with the terrain and the men, then known as the Troops of the United Provinces of North America. Organizing that force and laying out additional defensive lines to limit the British to their occupation of the town, he also established policies and identified shortages and additional requirements to the Congress. Following a comprehensive inventory, he discovered that the tools at hand were quite different from what he had been led to expect. Rather than 20,000 men, there were 14,000, with not one engineer present for duty, and that was a critical shortage given the nature of his defense and those fortifications. The storage magazines contained 90 rather than 308 barrels of powder, and shortages of muskets, cannon, tents, and uniforms presented serious problems. Despite a myriad of difficulties, the rebels were able to provide another stunning surprise on 2 March 1776 by fortifying Dorchester Heights with the cannon that Colonel Knox had brought from Fort Ticonderoga. This development made the city untenable, and General William Howe, who would replace General Thomas Gage, was said to have exclaimed, quote, "My God, those fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months," end quote. Ignoring the bloodbath that the British experienced when they attacked Breed's and Bunker Hills, General Howe gave serious consideration to assaulting the Dorchester Heights, but an unexpected blizzard forced the cancellation of that plan. And on 17 March, approximately 6,000 British soldiers and as many loyalists as could be accommodated boarded the ships available in Boston Harbor and departed for Halifax. And that brings to an end the Boston campaign. On the 3rd of July, a British fleet of over 400 ships transporting 32,000 soldiers, to include 8,000 German mercenaries, the largest amphibious fleet any European country had ever sent abroad, began landing troops on Staten Island. It was only coincidental that on the following day, the 4th of July, the Congress declared American independence. The upcoming Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn and the Battle of Brooklyn Heights, was fought on 27 August 1776. And we will look at that in more detail in just a moment. The Battle of Long Island was the first major action between British forces and the new Continental Army. Recognizing the importance of New York City and its harbor, General Washington had started moving troops in that direction before the British actually abandoned Boston. The shift of American forces was accelerated when it became clear General William Howe intended to establish his headquarters and garrison his troops in New York. Defending New York presented a host of difficult problems as surrounding waterways allowed the British fleet freedom of movement, and the city was dominated by Brooklyn Heights on Long Island, just across the East River. Not sure where the British main effort would develop, American soldiers were posted in the city to barricade key streets, and also continued the construction of Forts Lee and Washington on the Hudson River. About 1/3 of General Washington's troops, some 6,000 men, were ordered to build defensive positions on Brooklyn Heights, thus completing a deployment that put the Continental Army at greater risk than it would ever face again during the entire Revolutionary War. After preparing extensive defensive positions on Brooklyn Heights, the local American commander moved about 4,000 of his soldiers forward to the fortifications to guard roads leading toward the main defense. Unit commanders were unable to communicate effectively over the rough and heavily wooded ground, and the Jamaica Road on the far left flank of the American position was largely ignored. After locating the American lines and learning of the Jamaica Road, the British initiated a series of attacks the following day to hold the Americans in place, while successfully using that Jamaica Road to outflank the defenders with a force of 10,000 soldiers and 14 cannon. Widespread surprise and panic caused the American defense to collapse, although some units maintained their integrity and put up a stiff fight, allowing about 2,500 American survivors to regain the defenses on Brooklyn Heights. Confident of victory, but recalling their painful experience attacking the rebels on Breeds and Bunker Hill the previous year, the British decided to bring up siege guns before assaulting the American position. Despite a very real possibility that the British fleet might sail up the East River and isolate this portion of his force, General Washington continued to send troops from Manhattan across the river to the Brooklyn Heights position, and only contrary winds kept the British fleet from interfering. Finally responding to the self-imposed trap, General Washington conducted a withdrawal across the river during the night of 29 August, and the following morning the British were amazed to discover that the American defenses were empty. American losses totaled about 1,500 men, and the British reported 367 casualties. Approximately 9,000 American soldiers had performed a seeming miracle in the dark and the fog by escaping to take up new positions on Manhattan Island, while General Washington demonstrated organizational and leadership skills by rapidly collecting a flotilla of boats and ferrying his men across the major river, a feat he later repeated at Trenton. He also courted a disastrous situation by dividing his small army in the face of a superior force. Only the pace of British operations and a contrary wind allowed the two parts of the army to rejoin and fight another day. The British attack had featured that march around the American left flank, resulting in surprise and consternation among the rebels. A local boy, William Howard, remembered how his father was dragooned into guiding the British, and he's quoted as saying, "It was about 2 a.m. of August 27 when I was awakened by seeing a soldier at the side of my bed. I saw my father standing in one corner with 3 British soldiers before him with muskets and bayonets fixed. General Howe entered into conversation with my father. 'I must have some one of you to show me over the Rockaway path around the pass.' My father replied, 'We belong to the other side, General, and can't serve you against our duty.' General Howe replied, 'That is all right. Stick to your country or stick to your principles. If you refuse, I will shoot you through the head.' The British then had a knowledgeable, if somewhat reluctant, guide. Major Talmadge was with the American troops tending the fires and misleading the British the night of 29 August as the Army was ferried across the East River to Manhattan Island. He later recorded, "As the dawn approached, those of us who remained in the trenches became very anxious for our own safety, and when the dawn appeared, there were several regiments still on duty in the trenches. Finally, the order arrived for the regiment to retire, and we very joyfully bid those trenches a long adieu." When we reached the Brooklyn Ferry, the boats had not returned from their last trip to Manhattan Island, but they very soon appeared and took the whole regiment over to New York, and I think I saw General Washington on the ferry stairs as I stepped into one of the last boats that received the troops. I left my horse tied to a post at the ferry, end quote. But the fog was still very thick as the last Americans gained Manhattan Island, and Major Talmadge decided to return and get his horse. He called for volunteers to row him back, and the horse was safely retrieved. Once the troops had been ferried across to Manhattan Island, General Washington repeated his dangerous Long Island tactics. Had the British used their navy more effectively, or had the wind cooperated more consistently, they could have landed troops at King's Bridge, which was the only connection between Manhattan Island and the mainland, and thus bottled up and destroyed the Continental Army on Manhattan. When the Americans recognized their danger, they quit Manhattan for White Plains, leaving 2,900 men behind to garrison Fort Washington. While the fort was a strong position, once isolated, it came under a serious British attack and was soon forced to surrender, presenting an extremely grave loss to the rebellion. And thus ends the Long Island Campaign. I look forward to your comments. Please don't hesitate to let me know what you think about these campaigns, and I'll do my best to enter into a useful conversation. And until then, all the best, and God bless America.